Now, Bennett Bosky, you're a young lawyer working for a federal circuit judge and then a justice of the Supreme Court. The Gobitis case is decided by the court before you're a Supreme Court law clerk.
Well, it was decided before I was even a Court of Appeals law clerk.
Okay. Thank you. What's your recollection of this issue as it's taking shape, as a young law graduate?
Well, I probably had a view about it. I remember reading the Gobitis case. My personal view was with Justice Stone's dissent in the Gobitis case, but apart from that, it had no immediate impact. We didn't have cases coming to the Second Circuit at that time that involved Jehovah's Witnesses.
Okay.
So in my first year as a law clerk with Judge Hand, it never came up. We had things much more important, like East River collisions.
The Port of New York thanks you. Let's introduce another protagonist in this story. Your June 1941 boss, the new Chief Justice, Harlan Stone. Tell us about him.
Well, Harlan Stone had been an associate justice a reasonably long time. He had been appointed by his friend, President Coolidge. They had known each other way back. Coolidge had made him Attorney General in order to clean up the scandals in the Justice Department that included the Teapot Dome situation and various other things. He had been a successful Attorney General. He was put on the court, and he had found himself in harmony on many, many things with Justices Holmes and Brandeis and Cardozo. And as a matter, they were in the minority in the court at that time. And as a matter of fact, they had weekly conferences among themselves prior to the court's main conference, at which they thrashed out what their respective views were on cases. Now, when Stone was appointed Chief Justice, he thought it would be unsuitable to continue these partial court conferences, so they stopped. But in any event, the court was in the middle at this time of a constitutional crisis that began to stop during the Chief Justiceship of Hughes. The court had, by narrow majorities, turned down a great deal of the New Deal economic legislation, holding it unconstitutional, leading to President Roosevelt's plan to pack the Supreme Court with additional justices, a plan that did not succeed but became unnecessary because the court began to uphold these various congressional statutes. Now, Stone was the first of the justices to use two law clerks. Maybe it would help if I gave you some impression of what the court was like in those days. It was a smaller court as far as law clerks were concerned. Each justice had one law clerk, and when Stone became Chief Justice, he decided the Chief Justice should have two law clerks because he had more work to do, and which was true, and that the senior justice should be, senior law clerk should be a law clerk who knew something already about the court, which is how I came to be his senior law clerk. I had already been around the court for a year. Stone was a very careful judge. He was open-minded about almost any kind of a case that he hadn't already taken a position on. And he did his best to decide what the law was or what the law ought to be and come out where he thought he should come out. And he had lived through many dissenting opinions of his own. In the recent hearings that some of you may have been listening to on the confirmation of Supreme Court judges, all you kept hearing day after day was Roe versus Wade going to be overruled? And was it a terrible thing to overrule a constitutional decision? Well, a lot of the people on the Senate Judiciary Committee may believe they thought it would be a terrible thing. The fact is that the history of the United States has been loaded with cases where constitutional decisions have been overruled. It's true, as an earlier speaker said, not normally as quickly as the Gobitis case was overruled, but there's a long string of them. And many of them were cases where Stone had filed dissenting opinions. And I have to tell you, it was a matter of great gratification to Stone when his dissenting opinions in some of these earlier constitutional cases became the law of the United States. He did not think it was terrible to overrule a case. It ought to be overruled if it was wrong. He thought he knew what was wrong. But one of the other things about his relations with, at least with me as a law clerk, was that we hit it off very well. And cases came to the court in two ways. I don't want to try to educate you on the complex jurisdictional statutes that enable the court to take cases, but there are two routes to the court mainly. One is by an appeal as of right, and the other is by what's called a writ of certiorari. A writ of certiorari is a discretionary way of getting to the court. You don't get there unless 4 votes of the justices vote to grant a petition for certiorari. On the other hand, an appeal as of right, you have a right to go to the court, and it should not decline to hear the case, except for some extraordinary reason. Now, the Barnette case was a case where there was an appeal as of right, so that there was never any question that once the case had been decided by the so-called 3-judge district court in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses, there was never any question that the Supreme Court would have to hear it on the merits. And the other day, well, I'll tell you, the law clerks habitually wrote memoranda for their justices about cases that came up on the docket for consideration preliminarily. And in my case, this was before the days of computers, and we would type up or have typed up a little memorandum, and believe it or not, we used carbon paper for a duplicate. Now, carbon paper has almost disappeared from the American scene by now, but it was still in use in those days. And the other day, I guess last week, knowing I was coming here, I looked up my duplicate memorandum in the Barnette case. I hadn't looked at it in over 50 years. And here it was. At least here's a copy of it. And the first paragraph said just what I told you now, that the case was an appeal. There it was, and we would hear it. That's all it had to say. And then I said, well, there are two things, Chief Justice, that you might be interested in. And I added them in the memorandum. One was what the record showed, and what essentially one of you has already referred to. The record showed the respectful way in which the Jehovah's Witnesses said they would treat the flag by periodic public declarations. I just thought Stone would be interested in that, so I put it in this little memorandum. And the other was a paragraph on a terribly technical subject about what was equity jurisdiction. Please don't think about that.
Yeah. We'll move on.
It had nothing to do with this case. There was no question that there was equity jurisdiction.
Maureen Gaethje, let me ask you, did you have a sense that the Supreme Court was there for school children like you? You know, where you had a matter where something was being done wrong, rescue might be in the Supreme Court? Was that its role?
Not to me. I don't even remember realizing there was a Supreme Court at that time. That was before. That was before history class and
Right.
government classes. So,
Well, didn't you at least meet Hayden Covington at one point?
oh yes, we met him.
Right.
You're a lawyer in the Supreme Court?
That's right. Did you know that the Supreme Court or that the law was letting the principal do what he was doing to you? That there was something backing him up, that it wasn't just one man's pushy preference to send you home from school?
It was a school board,
Okay.
and he was subject to that.
Right.
And he said he had to do what they told him to do.
Okay.
He didn't have no choice.
Okay. Bennett, let's start talking about the intervening case, the Jones case, where the court starts to shift. That happens when you're working for Stone.
That did indeed, and it happened in a group of Jehovah's Witness cases that were being re-argued because of the change in the composition of the court. By a narrow margin, a series of cases had come up where local ordinances that restricted the Jehovah's Witnesses in their dissemination of their literature or required them to pay license fees in advance for doing so had come up to the court, and by very narrow majorities, these local ordinances had been sustained. And Stone had written a strong dissenting opinion for a group of 4 justices. Now, it then became clear that there was a change in the composition of the court, and the cases were still pending, could be pending on what's called a petition for rehearing. A petition for rehearing in the Supreme Court of the United States is almost never granted. It's the most futile of all documents that anybody can file in the Supreme Court of the United States.
You just lost a decision, and now you're asking the justices on a dime to say never mind.
And unless a justice who voted in the majority changes his mind, the petition will be denied. But here was an unusual set of circumstances. The court composition had changed. When Wiley Rutledge came on the court, it was known from his previous judicial expressions, because he had been on the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia Circuit. It was known that he was not with the majority of the Supreme Court, and so they decided to re-argue all these cases, these local ordinance cases. And they did re-argue them. By then, Rutledge and Jackson were the 2 new justices. Well, it was inevitable with Rutledge on the court that the 4 who had been in dissent would now have 5 votes. It wasn't entirely clear how Justice Jackson was going to vote. As it turned out, Justice Jackson voted with the old majority. He believed that these local restrictions on disseminating literature were not unconstitutional. But in the course of it, Justices Black, Douglas, and Murphy decided to do what many people at the time thought was gratuitous. The flag salute question was not involved in those cases. But they said that they wished to file a memorandum in those cases saying that they had changed their minds. And they meant it. They had changed their minds.
Was Stone pleased that they inserted that into the licensing cases?
He was certainly not displeased.
Right. It beats being a lonely dissenter.
That's right. And it made it clear that there were at least 4 votes for his side of the Gobitis case, and there were 2 more justices to be heard from. And it was pretty clear what Wiley Rutledge was going to say. And I have to say that in spite of the things that an earlier speaker read to you, I do not think it was inevitable that everybody knew for sure how Justice Jackson would vote in the flag salute case. There are other cases where, as a justice, he repudiated positions he had previously taken as Attorney General, and he tried to approach a lot of things with a truly open mind on the second go-around, and I don't think anybody was 100% sure of how he was going to end up voting. But the case came before this 3-judge court the district court that Judge Parker was the presiding justice of, and he said what lower courts seldom do. Lower courts theoretically are not supposed to anticipate reversals of Supreme Court positions. But Justice Parker was willing to say, well, it now seems to us that the Gobitis case very probably is no longer the law, and that we're free to decide this the way we think it ought to be decided, and we think it ought to be decided in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses. So that's how it came about that in the Supreme Court, the applicant for review was the state of West Virginia and not the Jehovah's Witnesses. Right. And the Jehovah's Witnesses were defending the judgment below instead of, in their usual position, attacking it.
Right. That's also how it came about that in the fall of 1942, you were back in school, even if the teacher wasn't thrilled about it. Mr. Covington has come up. He was Hayden Covington, the Watchtower Society's Supreme Court champion. Tell us, you remember meeting him as part of this legal process?
Yes, I remember meeting him, just a brief meeting in Charleston when he was there for the trial.
Okay. And
read a lot about him, heard a lot of his speeches, but...
At the time or subsequently?
Over the years.
Over the years, okay. Did you have a sense that Jehovah's Witnesses were involved in a lot of litigation, that court was part of? I mean, they were, in fact. Did you understand that?
Not really. When we talked to the lawyers, they tried to explain it to us, what they were going to do. Brother Covington was real nice about it, and even the lawyers, in Charleston. And but we didn't really apprehend, I don't think, how far it would go,
right,
or the importance of it.
Did you attend court for any of the Charleston activity?
We were there for one time. We didn't have to appear, we didn't have to testify, but we were there as onlookers at the time.
The only time I had to testify was the first time it went through a local Justice Peace. Yeah. Of course, he rolled against us before we even hardly got there. But,
but he went through the motions.
Yeah. But the higher courts, we didn't have to go.
Okay. Did you know that it was going to the Supreme Court after this victory at the three-judge court level?
Yes, we were told it was going to be taken.
Okay. And from Charleston, what did the Supreme Court in Washington mean to you?
I don't know.
I can't really remember too much about it back then.
Okay.
I was just glad that they was going to let us back in school.
Okay. It's a case that's not argued until the spring of 1943 in the Supreme Court. Bennett, did you attend the oral argument?
I don't really remember whether I did or not.
Okay.
I might have.
Okay.
Because occasionally the law clerks would listen to oral arguments if they thought there was going to be something especially interesting coming up or especially good argument coming up. I have to say that Hayden Covington argued many cases in the Supreme Court. Many of them were won by his side. There were those who said that his arguments had absolutely nothing to do with it, that it was because of the views that the justices had come to already, and not the briefs or the arguments being made by counsel that produced the result. And what normally happens in a case is that at the end of the argument week, in those days, the conference of the court, it spelled conference with a capital C. The conference of the court was still on Saturday. Later, it became on Friday. But the conference would be held, and a vote would be taken, and the junior justice would vote first, although he spoke last. He would then vote first, and nobody would be present in the conference room except the justices, which meant that the junior justice would have to open the door if there was a knock on the door to deliver a message. And Justice Breyer recently said that he was the junior justice for 11 years. And for 11 years, he was the one who had to open the door.
Welcome, Justice Alito.
He welcomed him indeed. But in any event, a vote was taken at the conference, and then the conference would break up, and the Chief Justice, if he was in the majority, would be the one who assigned opinions. Now, that is a tradition in the court that goes back to Justice Tawney before the Civil War. And no justice has ever seriously questioned the prerogative of the Chief Justice to assign opinions when he is in the majority. If he's not in the majority, then the senior justice in the majority assigns the opinions. And some Chief Justices are better than others in assigning opinions. There are many factors that enter into assigning opinions. I've written a little piece on the function of the Chief Justices in doing it for the Supreme Court Historical Society. And as you look at it over time, it's obvious that, well, Hughes was magnificent at it. Everybody who watched the way in which Hughes assigned opinions thought that he did it in a way that brought out the greatest strength of the court and got the court's business done most efficiently. Stone had a practice that I doubt that any other Chief Justice has indulged in. After the conference was over on Friday, Stone would call me in, and he would tell me what the vote had been on every case, and he would discuss with me the assignments he was about to make of opinions. And there was a little assignment sheet that when he decided to whom to assign opinions, he would write down the docket number of the case. And these assignment sheets would be distributed to each of the justices, either Friday night or Saturday morning, if possible. And the justices could go to work on their opinions whenever they pleased. The tradition was that Justice Holmes would get these things, and by Tuesday he had written his opinion. But not many justices behaved that way. And I particularly remember the question of to whom should he assign the opinion in the Barnette case. And if you think we have time, I'll go into that.
Please carry on. This is great.
Well, one of the factors that's very important where there's a divided court is to try to assign the opinion to somebody who will be sufficiently moderate in the way he writes it to hold the majority together. Because the last thing you want is to have an opinion, a draft opinion circulated that loses you some of the justices on that side of the case. Stone, having written the Gobaitis case, would have been overjoyed to be the author of the opinion in the Barnette case. But he had better sense than that. He knew that he had a new justice in Jackson. He knew that Rutledge, if Rutledge would give him the opinion, would write probably too wide an opinion to hold the 6 votes together. He had no hope that if Black, Douglas, or Murphy wrote the opinion, it would be sufficiently narrowly constructed to hold the 6 votes together. It might lose Jackson. So we talked about it some, and he decided the best thing to do for the court to get an opinion which would be subscribed to by the maximum number of justices, which in this case would be 6, would be to assign the opinion to Jackson, whatever chances that might involve taking. And that's what he did, and that's how Jackson, who was a relatively junior justice, ended up as the author of this terribly important opinion.
Did you change his mind, or was Jackson his idea from the beginning?
No, I don't think I changed his mind. I may have helped solidify his view, but we were not in different views on it.
In private, how was Chief Justice Stone thinking about these Jehovah's Witness cases and their trajectory during these first few years?
Well, he thought that the United States had gone through an unparalleled period of persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. He thought it was terrible. And that the court ought to do something to help bring it to a halt. And I think it's fair to say that it did do something to help bring it to a halt. Unlike Brown against the Board of Education, where 2 generations later, people are still scrapping about schools, I think
And race.
it's really relatively peaceful in the realm of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Did you have a sense, your case is in the Supreme Court, did you know this meant so many brilliant people were wrestling with the implications of this and what the right decision was and how to write an explanation of it? What's it like to be waiting for the Supreme Court?
I don't remember having a sense of that at that time. As an 8, 9-year-old, you really didn't think that deeply about things.
And you're back in school. You'd already won.
Right.
Did you like going back to school?
Sure did.
Yes. We were pretty good students, and we didn't want to be out of school.
Okay.
We weren't kids who looked for ways to stay home.
Right.
And so we wanted to be in school, and we were glad to be.
So it's
We
not
got
like
to go
Judge
back.
Parker ruined everything for you.
No, I was glad to get back.
Right. Now, in the writing process, do you remember Jackson drafting and circulating and
Well,
how
sir,
Stone interacted with him?
Well, what happens when opinions are written? They're circulated to the other members of the court in printed form as drafts. And any justice is at liberty to send back orally or in writing, a letter, or writing something on the margin, however he pleases, any suggestions. And when you see 50 years later the papers of a justice, which you now are beginning to see sometimes only 3 years later, but in the old days it was 50 years later, you see there's a great deal of written correspondence about opinions. One justice will write something to another saying, I suggest you change this sentence, or I'll go along with the opinion if you take out this sentence. And all kinds of suggestions. And the correspondence that Mason published first in his biography of Stone shows that Stone made certain suggestions to Jackson, and I think Jackson accepted them graciously. You normally do if you can do it with a straight face. Sometimes Hughes would accept, in order to get an opinion that became the opinion of the court with the maximum number of justices, Hughes was willing to accept things in his opinions that looked absolutely unbelievable, that looked as if they were in conflict with something else in his opinion. But that didn't bother Hughes as much as the problem of getting a united opinion of the court. There's one opinion of Hughes, for example, in a voting rights case in which 9 justices voted, on which Hughes said, as to a particular issue, on this question the court is evenly divided. And Harry Shulman, who was then, I guess, the dean of the Yale Law School, wrote a note entitled, Sawing a Justice in Half. But I later found out through Felix Frankfurter what had really happened in that case. Justice McReynolds, who was a very ornery justice, used to go off a little bit early before the end of the term on vacation. And in this particular case, the point involved was a new point that came up after Justice McReynolds had gone off on vacation. And nobody was going to try to call him back. He would have told them, frankly, go to hell. He wouldn't have come back. So Hughes just said, on this issue, the court is evenly divided.
Now, you've anticipated another person we need to talk about, Felix Frankfurter,
Yeah.
who had been your professor
Yeah.
and was an important mentor, awarded you the hand clerkship, and
Yeah.
was there as a justice during the Reed and Stone clerkships,
Yeah.
and somebody you had a very close relationship with, wrote the court's opinion in Gobitis,
He did indeed.
and now is becoming the dissenter in Barnette.
Yeah, and oddly enough, there's a written, published story of his dissenting opinion. He had a law clerk who was a classmate of mine named Philip Ellman at that time. And Philip Ellman gave an oral history to Columbia Law School. I don't know how many of you know that Columbia Law School has probably the most ambitious oral history project, at least in legal matters, in the country. And at some point, Philip was persuaded later in life to give an oral history of his life to this project. And after Phil died, it was published by the University of Michigan Press in a book called With All Deliberate Speed, The Life of Philip Ellman. And he's got pages in there about how Felix worked on this very ardent dissent in the Barnette case. And if you read those pages, you see that from the beginning, contrary to Frankfurter's practice with Phil on all other cases where he had an opinion, he told Phil not to work on this opinion. And he said that every now and then he would have a thought, he would put it down on a little piece of paper and put it in a drawer. And Philip shouldn't look at the drawer and should ignore it all, etc. And ultimately, there were a lot of pieces of paper in that drawer, and one night when the opinion finally had to be written, Felix invited Philip over for dinner. And they had a great dinner with an undue amount of wine, and Felix said to him finally, "Now let's go to work on the Barnette opinion." And he pulled out all these papers, and he kept handing them over, and he said to Phil, "Put them all together."
Now,
And that's how that opinion got written. And as I say,
Right.
Phil told the whole story.
it's an adamant defense of the Gobitis position. It's a
Yeah.
deeply personal, extremely passionate, eloquent, brilliant Frankfurter opinion, but in our view, I think most would say it was wrong as he had been wrong in Gobitis. Did you ever talk to him about this
Never.
later in life?
Never.
Never. Have to ask.
A lot of people did.
Right.
And actually, there are various people who tried to persuade him to take out that first sentence.
Right.
They
Why
did
don't
not succeed.
you- Right. Why don't you quote or paraphrase that first sentence? The gist of it is what?
Well, it said somebody who had belonged to the most violently, maybe I'd better just get you the exact wording. I brought this opinion with this Barnette opinion with me, and I have to tell you that this morning when I got up early, I reread it.
I did too.
But coming to his observations,
The gist of it is, or the takeoff point is that as a Jew, he knows persecution.
here we are. It says, one who belongs to the most vilified and persecuted minority in history is not likely to be insensible to the freedoms guaranteed by our Constitution. I'll also add the second sentence. Were my purely personal attitude relevant, I should wholeheartedly associate myself with the general libertarian views in the court's opinion, representing as they do the thought and action of a lifetime, but as judges, etc.
Right. As others talked
He
to
felt
him,
very strongly on
Right.
this subject, as you can see.
did he ever reconsider, to your knowledge?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And, when you're trying to draw the line between what obligations the state may impose and what are the limits of religious freedom or freedom of the press or free speech, it's always a question of where the line should be drawn. No rights under the Constitution are absolutely absolute. They're all subject to some constraint, in my humble opinion. And it is hard to say that those who shared the Frankfurter view were clearly wrong. It isn't something that you can say the answer is obvious. Now, it's a great tribute to Jackson and the others that they came out where they did. But that doesn't mean it's easy. These are difficult matters. That's what makes these opinions important.
Let me go to that decision day as you learn about it. You'd already won a year earlier. You're back in school. You're young girls, but your case was won. Do you remember that day or getting that news?
I do.
Yeah.
I remember when the lawyers, of course, called my uncle and my dad first, and then they told us. And I was glad about it.
It was, that's about it. I can remember them calling and telling us about it, that we'd won. And of course, we were very pleased with that.
At the local level, was there interest? Were people following this? Did they know you had this case?
Not at that time.
I don't think so.
Today. Here we are. Did the climate improve for Jehovah's Witnesses in your community over?
Yes, very, very favorable.
And do you think the decision played a role in that?
I think so.
Okay. Now, Bennett, the decision came down on June 14, 1943, which happens to be Flag Day.
A month before Bastille Day.
A month before Bastille Day. Is that just the next Monday that rolled around, or was Barnette aimed at that decision day?
Oh, I don't think it was aimed at it. The court has always tried to hand down decisions as soon as they're ready, without regard to considerations that would make it easier for the press or easier for the litigants.
Right. Do you remember being in court on the announcement day?
Nope, I
Okay.
do not remember.
Okay. How did Stone feel about this vindication and this development?
As I said earlier, he was always gratified when views that he had expressed that had been minority views became the law of the United States.
Fair. Let me push you a little bit. This isn't just a question of legislative power under the Commerce
No,
Clause.
but
This is
I'm talking about constitutional
constitutional
cases.
liberties. Okay.
I mean, there are a lot of cases in a field that those of you who are here today probably are not interested in. The power of the states to tax what had been regarded as immune interstate commerce, where Stone had had a minority view that suddenly it all unraveled and it came his way. There were other constitutional things that came his way, and it pleased him. I don't say that he was an unduly vain man, but this made him feel good.
More than 60 years later, here we are, and it obviously has great importance in our constitutional law. How do you think about the legacy of West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnette?
Well, I think it's one of the cases that is not likely to be overruled.
Is it a case that you regard as limited to its context? Is it about the 40s, or is it about schools, or is it about Jehovah's Witnesses?
Well, if you read and reread the opinion, as you and I both did this morning, you will see that it's written with both an elegance and an eloquence that has application way beyond its borders.
for the victors, how do you think of this case? How do you think about being the Barnette sisters? The court misspelled your name, but it is your case, and it is your principle that was vindicated. What does that mean in the lives you've lived since then and going forward to each of you?
Well, I'm glad that it meant freedom for everyone, for their beliefs, and that we can stand up for them and be proud of them. And glad that it was in our favor. And it helped out through the years to our children when they had to face the same issue in school a lot of times. And so I'm just glad that everybody got, is helped by it.
Okay. Marie?
About the same thing. I especially happy that it helped the kids after us, that came after us, even, like she said, even down to this day. It's still giving them a freedom to go to school without harassment and everything. And it's I guess it really means more to us today than it did 60-some years ago, because we think more about it today than we did then.
I heard a wonderful anecdote as we were preparing yesterday. Someone locally was meeting with a school administrator in Jamestown and discussing this event and started to explain West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnette. And the school administrator stopped the person and opened the desk drawer and pulled out some kind of briefing paper, manifesto, decree, which makes it clear that that principle is alive and well in our schools. And I think we all owe you a lot of thanks for that.
It is alive, because I remember when my oldest son was sent to the office for not saluting the flag, the principal come back and said, "Your teacher obviously don't remember the Supreme Court decision."
That's great. On behalf of the Robert Jackson Center and the Supreme Court Historical Society, please join me in thanking Bennett Bosky and Gaithy Edmonds and Marie Snodgrass for this wonderful conversation. I'd like to conclude with a few moments on one of the players. I think this conversation has been wonderful because it has not exaggerated the importance of this player. But here in the Robert H. Jackson Center, it is certainly important to note, and I think to close on, a few words about Robert H. Jackson, the person whose life and legacy is commemorated here in this institution, and whose words on behalf of the majority of the Supreme Court are West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnette. Jackson's background is, from a biographer's perspective, of course, of great interest, but I think particularly relevant to the matter that we've been discussing. His life beginning in Pennsylvania, not quite in Minersville, but Warren County, Pennsylvania, where his Spring Creek birthplace is located, is not too many hours from Minersville, and then moving to Frewsburg, and then moving to Jamestown, and then moving to Washington and the world stage, had religious threads woven in it that I think are part of this Barnette story. The Jacksons were Christians and believers, but not particularly churchgoers. And in that respect, they were largely out of step with the communities in which young Robert Jackson grew up. For example, in Frewsburg, his family home, his boyhood home, was literally across the street from the Baptist church. He wrote later that his parents sent him there for Sunday school because it was there, but it was not particularly important in a religious sense. He, as an adult, was married to a woman who had much stronger commitments to their Episcopalian faith, and when their children came of a certain age, their son William was due to be confirmed. And Bill Jackson said to his father, "Why do I have to go through this if you never did?" And you'll note Robert Jackson, perhaps in a bit of unprincipled abdication, you see this on some documents that are in a display just down the hall, was baptized and confirmed as an adult. And he said it was easier to just go through with it than to fight it out with Bill about why he had to, if the old man had not. But his out of a fairly devoted Christian mainstream, as this region was, as a quite passive believer, is only a piece of the climate and the environment that shaped him. For those who are locals or regional residents, it's known to you, but some may not know that this area is, in American history, a source of great religious ferment, development, and denominational strains that are quite distinct. The Mormon movement began in Elmira, passed through this area, and of course went west. Up the lake and inland just a little bit is the Lilydale Spiritualist community, which had, of course, to this day, I think, a belief system. In the woods near Frewsburg is the site of the former Kayentone movement. Believers, a sect or a separate community that had its housing. Jackson, as a young boy, decades after Kayentone had ceased to be living there and those buildings were no longer standing, loved to hike and ride and explore and learn, and as an adult studied in detail the history of the Kayentone movement. I'm learning as we speak that the community Jackson was a young lawyer in, Jamestown, in the 1910, 11, 12, 13 time period, was a community with Jehovah's Witnesses, both English-speaking and Swedish-speaking. At the lake at Celeron, there was a Jehovah's Witnesses meeting, a very sizable one in 1913. In other words, Robert Jackson wasn't of them, he was near them, he was aware of them, and that has to be a part of his thought process a couple decades later when he's a judge evaluating rights claims. In particular, I think Jackson's voting, which, as Bennett Bosky summarized, includes votes to uphold some of the restrictions, general state restrictions on Jehovah's Witnesses, but of course his vote in Barnette to strike down the flag salute, connects back to two particular events in his own boyhood, which he, in his candor and maturity, wrote in his old age, relatively old age. He first described as a young boy going with a friend to a revival meeting in a tent somewhere outside Frewsburg, and during the preaching, many people would feel the Spirit and were overcome and would physically collapse. And Jackson and his friend feigned the same experience, making fun of the believers at this meeting. Well, when Jackson's family got wind of this, his father gave him a severe whooping, which I think is an early piece of constitutional doctrine that might stick with one about freedom of people to believe and practice without being mocked or attacked if you're not one of them. And then there's a second event that I think is even closer to the mark. Jackson, as a very young boy, was often in the care of his grandfather. His parents worked on a farm and were very busy during the days. His grandfather had less mobility and time on his hands, had served his years in the fields and was caring for the young boy. And one day, a proselytizer came to the door. And this person knocked, and Jackson's grandfather answered, and this person preached. And Jackson's grandfather stood and listened. And it took quite a period of time before the visit was over and grandfather Jackson had closed the door. At which point, as young Robert recounts it decades later, he said basically, why did you put up with that? You don't believe in any of that. What was that all about? And the grandfather's answer was it was about respect. It was about listening to a person in a way that wasn't impinging on me in any great way, practicing their belief and treating them respectfully. Now, Robert Jackson, by 1940, when Gobitis is decided, the Supreme Court's constitutional upholding of disrespect in the flag salute context in Minersville, Pennsylvania, is in the cabinet. He's the Attorney General of the United States. And he's a close friend of Felix Frankfurter, and he's in proximity to this process, and he is arguing bitterly that the court has made a wrong mistake. There's a famous meeting, Sean Peters in his book recounts it, at Archibald MacLeish's home, where a heated argument breaks out, and Jackson is on the anti-Frankfurter, anti-Gobitis side. He also argues that position on the fringes of a cabinet meeting in that time period. And to jump over Barnette, I don't think that is disconnected, and I don't think Barnette is disconnected from the work he does a few years later at Nuremberg, where a part of the evidence of crimes against humanity that is proven and prosecuted by Robert Jackson as the chief American prosecutor is religious persecution, including persecutions of Jehovah's Witnesses. And of course, in 1943, there is Barnette itself. It is a decision of the court. It is an opinion authored by Robert Jackson in his eloquence and great skill. It's a drafting process in which he is assisted enormously and mentored by Chief Justice Harlan Stone, who, in addition to the Barnette sisters, would be at the top of my heroes list with regard to the Barnette case. I think it's appropriate to close simply with a few paragraphs from that opinion of June 14, 1943. The case is made difficult, not because the principles of its decision are obscure, but because the flag involved is our own. Nevertheless, we apply the limitations of the Constitution with no fear that freedom to be intellectually and spiritually diverse or even contrary will disintegrate the social organization. To believe that patriotism will not flourish if patriotic ceremonies are voluntary and spontaneous instead of a compulsory routine is to make an unflattering estimate of the appeal of our institutions to free minds. We can have intellectual individualism and the rich cultural diversities that we owe to exceptional minds only at the price of occasional eccentricities and abnormal attitudes. When they are so harmless to others or to the state as those we deal with here, the price is not too great. But freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance is the right to differ as to things that touch the heart of the existing order. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not occur to us now. In an interesting way, those words and this decision has become something of an American, I use the word cautiously, prayer. It is a part of what we are as a polity. It is part of our civic constitution. It is part of what frees each of us from our adulthood to our earliest years in school to believe devoutly and practice sincerely that which is our calling. And we're lucky to have here the people who, in the most direct sense, played a role in making it possible, the two litigants and law clerk, and we thank them very much.
Wow. Extraordinary, unique event. And on behalf of the Robert H. Jackson Center and on behalf of all in attendance here, I'd like to thank Gaithy Edmonds, Marie Snodgrass, Bennett Bosky, John Barrett, Sean Francis, Peters, Barrett Prettyman, certainly the Supreme Court Historical Society for assisting us in making this happen here, and to just give them one last applause for making this just a wonderful event. Thank you very much. Please join us for lunch and have a chance to meet and greet our special guest. Thank you very much for coming.